Alright students, welcome back to Medieval 1450. I hope you are all doing well. Today we are going to take a look at the connected subjects of gender and authority. We will talk about some of the medieval perspectives on the subject, as well as some of those who push against some of the social norms and attitudes. Of course, these are subjects still explored in modern debate. These are not questions we today can so easily wave aside. As befitting such a topic, many of the things we will discuss today will touch on difficult subjects, including sexual violence. So be forewarned. Let us discuss first some of the common perceptions we see about gender and authority through medieval writing. First, we should define something known as authority. Now, this is a word that comes to us from auctoritas, and this root, auctor, is also the term from which we get the word author. The author is thus the one who has or creates authority through erudite writing. Now, how do we establish that a writer is an auctor, i.e. that he has authority in his word? This goes back to the discussion of authority we had back on our education day. All authority ultimately comes from God. Through Scripture, the Church Fathers, and other authors, the authority is transmitted. Much like an essay is substantiated and given authority through quotes, applying clear reference to these earlier works helps link your authority back to God. This was the fundamental scholastic method, one which the clergy as a whole accepted, and which therefore was applied to a vast majority of written material in the Middle Ages. But there's a fundamental problem with this method of authority. All the transmitters of authority are male. The writers of Scripture, the Church Fathers, all male. This means the fundamental text from which scholarship derives its authority are all biased towards a male perspective on the world, and a male perspective on women as well. Additionally, as we have mentioned on Education Day, the university system, which provided the education necessary to give you personal authority and the training to use past authority, is only open to men. With fewer roads to gain literacy, let alone the deep familiarity with past scholarship, women had a far harder time breaking into this chain of authority to present their own perspective. So what was the male-dominated authoritative position? Well, their perspective tied them into a philosophical tradition reaching back to ancient Greece. Hesiod, one of the oldest Greek texts and text writers, paints women as a danger to the household, framing the myth of Pandora's box as a tale of a woman who disobeys her husband. She opens not a box, but a pithos, a grain storage jar. Her unleashing the evils is poor management, squandering the household's limited resources. By the heyday of Greek philosophy, this message has not been much moderated. The world is seen as a place characterized by dualities. On the one hand, you have that which is male, order, civilization, intellect, reason, and strength. On the other hand, there is that which is female, chaos, wilderness, desire, emotion, and weakness. Women are often depicted as base, lustful, and weak, and in general inferior to men. They are malleable, being easily tricked or tempted. The proper place for women in such an image is one away from the temptations that threaten them. They must be controlled or contained, either by being married or placed within a domestic sphere, or through a nunnery where they cannot be led astray. Women thus can be both temptresses and the tempted, two ways to vilify their existence. But not all women were kept away from authority. We've discussed Hrotsvit before, but we will today spend a bit more time with her. Hrotsvit, through her position as a nun, has a way to access authority in the same comprehensive way men do. Through her position and her writing, she challenges these gender preconceptions and asserts that women can gain access to and use authority just as men can. Let's take a look at how she does this in the preface to one of her dramas, which include the text Ocydius that we've already read. Oh, and if you haven't seen them before, note the slashes are used to indicate separate lines in the original text. This passage gives us an idea of how she claims authority. First of all, why does she suggest pagan works like those of Terence are so popular? She suggests they are so popular because they are fun, right? The beauty of their eloquent style overrides their uselessness. Therefore, if Hrotsvit is to challenge their place in popular mindsets, she clearly argues that she must provide texts that include not just this eloquence, but also the subject matter which caused me to blush, as she says. However, Hrotsvit also has a purpose in all of this, right? What is that? And here we are, so that the self-same form of composition in which shameless acts of lascivious women were phrased, the laudable chastity of sacred virgins may be praised. Sir Hrotsveit is trying to create a new image, balancing the style of those like Terence and her own goals. And to think about how this works, think back to the virgins from Dulcidius. How are they portrayed? Well, it's quite the opposite of weak-willed women. Classical and many medieval authors would portray Hrotsveit's virgins have the strongest faith and morals of the play, don't they? So Hrotsveit seeks to use Christian imagery and ideas combined with an image of a new image of women, but package it in a style amenable to the masses. And you know what? It worked. Her plays were considered humorous and were performed quite often. Now, before we leave Hrotsveit, I want to talk about something that dominates the second half of her preface. While Hrotsveit states her education, that it is her education enables her to speak with authority, she spends a great deal of time denigrating her own skill, such as the line, "I am not such a braggart, nor so presumptuous as to compare myself to the least of these scholars as pupils." So is Hrotsveit being fully honest in this, or is something more going on in this proclamation of humility? Well, she's all writing a preface to a series of dramas. This is an example of what is known as the humility topos. A topos is a formulaic pattern, one used in literature to conform to certain expectations. We've already seen humility used before. Remember how those descriptions of Charlemagne emphasizes humility? The introduction to many medieval texts express the humility at great length. This allows Hrotsveit to put forward her own credentials without coming across as arrogant. She also can better debate the concepts of great scholars of the past without seeming like she is ignoring their claim to authority. And of course, as a woman, she wants to be conforming to the conventions of literature in order to reaffirm her claim to authority despite prejudices. Up till now, we've been discussing authority in this textual sense, coming from a chain of textual work going back to God. But is that the only way to exert authority? Of course not. As you know, there are other ways to learn many things. Experience in the world was another way to present authority. Just as the world was God's creations, things can be learned through active engagement in it, and especially through the application of one's senses and of logic to what is experienced. This is rather similar to the justification for the use of classical sources in scholasticism. Despite not linking back directly to God, they are authorities on some forms of experience. This, however, is a different path to knowledge. It allows those with experience to demonstrate their authority on a subject without literacy. For many women, this was a way to leverage their own lives to demonstrate authority when the textual method was denied to them. Life experience could come in many forms. For Julian of Norwich, for example, her writings depended on a series of visions. As revelation, her experience bypassed great authors, even scripture, getting straight to the divine to prove her authority. For Marjorie Kemp, on the other hand, travel was the primary source of experiential authority. Her journeys gave her first-hand witness to events and places, granting her authority for what she said. Now we're going to start moving to the other main piece for today, and that is the wife of Bath's Tale. For starters, let's meet Chaucer, this piece's author. Chaucer was quite the character. He survived despite quite some things set against him. First and foremost, he was a child when the Black Death hit England and survived that. He served as a soldier at the time when England was fighting the 100 Years' War in France and survived that. He was a learned man, learning French, Italian, and Latin in addition to his native English. With the Italian skill, he read the Decameron, a text we'll read an excerpt from on Black Death Day. He also knew the English king due to his service in the English court. Over the course of his lifetime, his career led him to many places, as he was a page, a soldier, a diplomat, a customs controller, a manager of infrastructure projects, and a member of parliament. He thus interacted with all walks of life, either by working with them or having responsibility over them, having a place in trade, court life, and politics. Like El Cid, he was a self-made man. Coming from an urban middle class, he ascended to a height where his daughter married into the nobility. This is someone who has experience. In his writing, it is perhaps no surprise that he lampoons all walks of life, from high to low, religious included. He draws from the many themes and sources he encountered in his life, and wrote in many styles and genres. The Canterbury Tales is Chaucer's most famous work. It is written in Middle English. Now, back near the start of the course, we saw Old English with the Dream of the Rood. If you recall, it was very unlike modern English. You can see the Middle English text in primary sources, alternating that and a modern translation. It's recognizably English, but as you can tell, it's very different, with spelling and even grammar having changed a lot before the present. Note, this is Middle English. Shakespeare may be an older form of English, but Shakespeare was not Middle English. The entire text is what is called a frame narrative as well. This is a type of story that is effectively a story within a story with subordinate tales packaged into the framing story. We've read an excerpt of one such frame narrative in El Conde Lucanor, the excerpt being the story about Al-Hakem, the dude who, got made fun of for his improvements for the flute. In the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer is traveling to Canterbury with a group of pilgrims. Pilgrimage is an activity that all sorts of people took place in, and as such, saw many walks of life traveling together. It was a great leveler and a good excuse to bring these characters together. The introduction lays out that there are 30 pilgrims, evidently each was to tell 2 stories on the way to Canterbury and 2 back. 24 stories are in the final product. It was seemingly not even close to completion, but the stories gave a slice of life packaged in an entertaining form that few other texts even came close to in that time period. Now, why Canterbury? Well, Canterbury has been a pilgrimage site since the death of Thomas Becket some 200 years prior to the writing of the story. Thomas Becket became Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162 in the reign of Henry II of England. The Archbishop of Canterbury had authority over southern England, giving him a great deal of power when it comes to the kings of England. Now, Thomas Becket and Henry had known each other for decades, with Thomas having long had a place at court. However, they became embroiled in a conflict over their respective authority. At the base was the question of whether or not the church or the king had authority over English clergy. At one point in 1170, exasperated by the ongoing conflict, Henry II supposedly said, "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?" Some of his men, according to story, took him literally at his word, and went and killed Thomas Becket within the bounds of the Canterbury Church. As you can imagine, this did not go over well. Henry II was forced to seek penance for his actions. In the process, Becket became a martyr, a man of God killed through secular greed and ambition. As a saint, he became known for miracles, healing those who have been sinful. With such a saint, and already established as the ecclesiastical capital of England, it was the primary destination for pilgrimage in England. But let's look at the wife of Bath's tale itself. Because of the complex things she has to say about gender, she's probably the most studied characters from these tales. So, what is she like? Well, the general prologue of the Canterbury Tales tells us a lot about her. She's not exactly pretty. It certainly isn't those charms that has won her husbands. She's an independent seamstress, putting her at the level of power and autonomy that few women had in this time. She dresses very ostentatiously, that is, in bright, very noticeable colors. This also tells us that she is not a woman easily confined to a domestic sphere, again a description of someone who is problematic for gender norms. The final aspect of her is that she is gap-toothed. This is another example of coding. Those who are gap-toothed are supposedly very lustful in the medieval mindset. She also wears spurs and rides like a man, one leg on either side of the horse, as you can see in the image on the slide. Her prologue, where she introduces herself, is split between her perspectives on marriage and her own history. Why don't we start as she does on the subject of marriage? Now, the wife of Bath has a long discussion of the righteousness of marriage. It's an important subject for someone who has been married 5 times like she has. Surviving 5 husbands is an impressive feat, isn't it? Now, what is her position on marriage, and even multiple marriages? Well, she is generally quite positive about them, isn't she? We also have several points used to argue for marriage as a good thing. We get justification based on St. Paul, the biblical figures of Solomon and Abraham, and naturally some mention of Christ. There's also the discussion from lines 95 to 104 about the value of a wife who is not a virgin. Go through these justifications, and before you decide whether it's a good justification or not, I want you to ask whether each one is based upon textual authority or experience. After all, she starts this prologue by emphasizing experience over written authority. But how does she really defend her actions? Now, let's address her husbands. She's had 3 quote-unquote good husbands. Why are they good? I mean, it's pretty simple, really. She controls them. They work and give her power in the household, and now this excerpt has cut the 4th husband. He cheats on her, although not directly cruel to her. His looking to another woman for pleasure undercuts any sort of loving relationship, and of also threatening her power over him. But it's the 5th one that really takes the cake. What does he do, as noted in line 634? He hits her after she damages his book. Besides that being a denial of her power in the relationship, it's just plain physical abuse. Her damaging what is clearly a treasured and valuable possession is absolutely no excuse for what he does. But what does this book, describing starting on line 669, say that she damaged? Well, somewhat conveniently to the story, it is a book of wicked wives, a detailed list of women who betray, murder, and otherwise do terrible things to their husband, from Eve to Clytemnestra of Greek myth, and he just reads it out to her daily. But around line 692, how does the wife counter this? She asks, who painted the lion? She's referencing how these stories are written by men, and that this colors how women and men are described. In the end, she uses violence to get control of the situation, have the book destroyed, and brought him in line. Once again, not really particularly acceptable behavior, but just an aspect of the plot. Let's move on to her tale. Once more, we are set off to the mythic realm of King Arthur. We start by lamenting the changing of the times, but quite quickly the story begins. It starts with a man in Arthur's court. What crime does he commit? Yes, he forces himself on a young maiden. This gets him brought to Arthur for justice, but the queen and other ladies take charge of the judgment. By line 905, what is the ultimatum he is faced with? Okay, so it shows that the knight has a year and a day to find out. How does his search go? Not very good, right? The knight searches but cannot find a single answer to the question. By 983, he is running out of time with no clear answer. Then he goes to a group of women but finds only an old crone. What does this old crone offer? Basically, she responds with, I will give you the answer, but you have to do something unnamed of my choosing. As you might guess, such deals often do not go well for the one making them, but he doesn't have much of a choice. So he goes to the queen and gives the answer. What women desire is to have sovereignty. And he goes on to describe what this sovereignty means. Now, why is this significant in light of his previous behavior? The whole tale began with his raping of a woman. This is a horrendous violation of another woman's bodily sovereignty. Now he knows and understands this, and submitting to the court he has given his life. Of course, now that the deal comes into effect, the old woman demands he marry her, and he is bound to agree. When we then get this issue where the knight is not exactly happy in bed with her, and she offers him a choice in line 1220 to either be an ugly woman who won't leave him or be troubled in any way, or be young, beautiful, and maybe she won't be faithful. What does the knight choose? As a final demonstration of having learned the meaning of the question, he instead chooses to not make the choice. He grants his wife the choice, and thus fully granting her power in the relationship. And lo and behold, because he learned his lesson, she becomes not only beautiful, but also loyal. This, then, is the wife of Bath's message. Recognizing the autonomy and authority of women is just the right thing to do. Now, before we finish today, I want you to think about something. Geoffrey Chaucer was a man writing about a woman, talking about a man granting a woman autonomy. Which, if you want a perfect example of a frame narrative, there it is right there. The wife of Bath definitely embodies some negative traits we discussed of women as depicted by male authorities. That is lustful, dangerous to a male control of a family, and so on. So is Chaucer just giving an example of such a stereotype, mocking the stereotype through her, or actively promoting a world where women are given rights as an act beneficial to all? Something to think about, and that may come up as part of our discussion questions for today.